Start recording.
Okay, is anyone not ready? Great. The order will just be two arguments. Cool. First on why the IMF program is good, then on why debt restructuring is bad. One, the IMF program is good. The IMF has good incentives. One, IMF power is conditionalized on buy-in from smaller countries. This is particularly the case with developing economies in Africa, who are facing a choice with the increased sovereignty over their own resource extraction. Do they turn to institutions like the IMF? Or do they turn to institutions like China or BRICS, for example? Which means the IMF has strong incentives to do good things for these countries so that they attract buy-in. This means the IMF is going to offer good conditions on the loan. In the events of the default, it is unlikely to do stuff like pursue aggressive austerity measures because it actively causes other small countries to buy out of the IMF. Comparatively, note that people have an expectation of aggressive actions from financial creditors because they compete in a global market, which means often people are less willing to scrutinize bad actions taken by firms insofar as they are just viewed as part of natural capitalist competition. They can deflect this as how the market works, as opposed to the IMF, which is a public institution which must justify all of its actions in terms of the public good. Second, this creates incentive alignment. The argument here is simple. The IMF is not going to sell the debt on the secondary market because they're not about making money, they're about world development. Comparatively, creditors have disaligned incentives because you have stuff like CDSs and betting on the economy to fail, which so the existence of the secondary market ensures that creditors are not terminally tied to the well-being of the economy. I'll get to that later, but the framing level claim that is relevant is just that the IMF now has incentives to do stuff like offer other loans in other areas of the economy to boost the overall structural efficiency over their economy. Third, the IMF has to correct a historical perception of bias against African countries. Of progressive trackback on fiscal colonialism means there's always a high degree of scrutiny in all the loans that the IMF is offering to African economies. The implication is that these measures are likely to be good and based on metrics of objective development by leading economists who have tons of expertise in the world. They are not likely to be predatory or colonial. B, incentive alignment for the Kenyan government. Right now, the Kenyan government's incentives are disaligned with the Kenyan people. The reason is the principal agent gap, i.e., politicians have short-term incentives to be re-elected, but people need long-term incentives to be represented in order to have sustainable development and lift millions of people out of poverty. This means that in the status quo, Kenyan politicians are more likely to spend wastefully rather than focusing on sustainable development. That is, they are more likely to line the pockets of oligarchs who are key to the next election as opposed to developing sustainable long-term development problems. Why does IMF loans align incentives uniquely? One, because blatant corruption means there's literally no more money which comes to the country, which causes oligarchs themselves to push against corrupt leaders because they fear stuff like IMF sanctions, for example, which cut into their personal wealth. And two, because politicians are incentivized to score political points by supporting long-term infrastructure projects backed by the IMF. That is, on our side of the house, the fact that the IMF is visibly offering this to Kenyan politicians means those politicians have an incentive to work with the IMF because otherwise they are demonized for not taking valuable development, which means they do inevitably end up doing things like tying their own political livelihood and success to long-term IMF structural problems. The third argument under this claim, or C, anti-corruption measures that the IMF does are directly good. The argument here is that even if OP has accessed some degree of anti-corruption measures, we think that corruption measures uniquely require a long time horizon to be effective. This is for two reasons. One, corrupt officials hide themselves. Obviously, they have an incentive to hide their corruption, and obviously they have sophisticated means of hiding that corruption, which means oftentimes it takes a large amount of time to find out about that corruption. Two, because oftentimes corruption is not located in the individual, but rather there are networks, i.e. one person taking bribes from another person, which necessitates that you explore that network to its roots, which means that on their side of the house, they have some short-term solvency for corruption, some large leaders who are squashed, but they're playing a game of whack-a-mole and more corrupt leaders pop up in the future. This is the structural characterization that controls the overall ability of the Kenyan government to advocate for its people. On our side of the house, the fact that we have sustained long-term anti-corruption measures means we're comparatively more likely to root out corruption. This has a couple of facts. First, directly, the Kenyan government is more likely to do stuff like advocate for good policies for the Kenyan people, i.e. they're less likely to do stuff like take money from oligarchs and build bullshit public housing projects that never get completed because they want to line the developers' pockets, and more likely to actually follow through on these projects. But two, obviously it's the case that you just get better loans and better conditions on loans down the line because investors perceive them to be more responsible. More on that later. Our second argument is just directly why restructuring is bad. First under this is why creditors are terrible. One is the race to the bottom effect. We think that large creditors know that they have leverage to get paid back, but they're competing with other large creditors who also have leverage. So they always have an incentive to do the most threatening or the most coercive measures to get paid back first before the Kenyan economy runs out of money in the process of restructuring and by paying back other large creditors with leverage. Why is this a problem? Because the way that debt works, if you default to one person, you're insolvent, i.e., if I owe $100 to John, $100 to Harry, and $100 to Peregrine Beckett, for example, and I fail to repay John and Harry because Perry is extorting such coercive measures on my economy that I am forced to do stuff like give most of my money to him because he's forcing, like charging me a ton of interest, for example, or threatening me in international courts. This ensures that there's always some smaller creditor who is never paid back. The implication of this is that the overall credit rating of the entire Kenyan economy is tanked, which controls the ability of the Kenyan government to even get good loans down the line. This is one, a scalar question of how much money gets invested in the economy, but two, a question of how good those loans are to begin with, i.e. on their side of the house, the Kenyan government takes more loans which are conditionalized on bad things, stuff on bad actors with high interest rates who demand stuff like austerity to get paid back quickly, whereas on our side of the house, they have a comparatively better credit rating, more on that later, which means they attract structurally more sustainable investment overall. This is the biggest structural link into poverty insofar as it concerns whether or not the government is likely to do stuff like cut welfare programs, which are vital for thousands of people. Second, under this is that bad actors uniquely spoil negotiations. Empirically, there's stuff like CDSs or financial instruments which allow certain investors to bet against economies being successful, i.e. to buy high and sell low. This is uniquely likely for economies like the Kenyan economy because there's a history of instability, a perception of corruption and colonialism, which ensures that there's always actors who are trying to predate off of these economies. The implication is that these creditors always have an incentive to hold out because they benefit from negotiations failing. Why is this a problem? Note that these firms do stuff like turn around and sell debt on the secondary market to vulture funds who do everything possible to get the money back, i.e. seizing assets through international courts and like doing like really bad and predatory shit. The implication of this being that negotiations are never successful on their side of the house because there's fundamental incentive disalignment. Some creditors benefit from the negotiations being successful, where some creditors benefit from the negotiations failing. So the negotiations just end up fucking failing, which also obviously links into all the arguments above about nuking the overall credit rating of the economy. Our third argument is just the signaling effect. Two parts to this. First, we think that when you try to do stuff like structurally renegotiate your entire debt, this basically is like screaming that you are declaring bankruptcy. It is a massive signaling effect to other investors that you're currently unable to be a good investment client, that you're unlikely to be a stable climate for investment in the future. The implication of this is it causes investors to pull out even if you don't have bankruptcy, which exacerbates the problem because oftentimes bankruptcy is a question of margins, i.e. the country having a few billion less dollars, which means that even if there's marginally more investors that pull out when you do stuff like declare that you're bankrupt and try to restructure, it ultimately triggers the bad impacts we're talking about above. But second, under this, the IMF is a uniquely credible institution, has a unique degree of buy-in from Western investors in particular, which means when you do stuff like extend the program, it signals their goodwill and confidence in your economy, which spurs the overall scalar amount of investment. Proud to propose.
Thank the PM for the great speech. Hello, whenever you're ready.
Am I sitting or standing? I'll sit. Order is framing off on. Three, two, one. On framing at the top, we think that if we can prove that Kenyan default is inevitable, none of their arguments are unique. They're going to trigger in both worlds. Four reasons why that's true. First, there's always going to be more debt that's publicly revealed. The government is always incentivized to hide debt in order to help their public standing and encourage investor confidence, as per all the arguments they go for. But secondly, even if that's not true, they're more likely to take on new debt. Every 8 years, there's a boom-bust cycle, which harms poor countries more because they have less money to put into fiscal stimulus. So they have to borrow that money in order to invest in and save their economy, which means that even if it is true that there's not larger amounts of debts than we see now, there will be in the future. Thirdly, tariff revenues, which we've told you Kenya are relying on, are by definition volatile. Political challenges, trade issues with other countries, etc., are always going to be harmful. Note Kenya's specific strategic geopolitical place in Eastern Africa, whereby the most of the money they get from is from tariff revenues from their seaport in Mombasa. That argument is really important because it tells you that the main way in which they get their money is by definition volatile, which means they're always going to have to be reliant on borrowing, which is going to lead to default. But fourthly, they don't have the structures in place necessary to collect tariffs and taxes. Kenya is rural. They don't have access to the infrastructure money to physically build the roads to go and get tariff revenue from more rural communities. So if restructuring is inevitable in the form of default, the question is whether or not you extend the payment and do that in a couple of years, or don't extend the payment and do that now. With that framing, two arguments. First, all of their debt restructuring arguments happening in the short term are going to lead to, all of our debt restructuring arguments happening in the short term are going to lead to better poverty reduction now. First, IMF framework is going to lead to more austerity in the short term. A few reasons for this. First, it leads to all of their arguments about reducing corruption are just cutting bureaucracy, including welfare departments. They can't efficiently target corruption in these countries because they don't know where it is. All of their arguments about how it's hard to determine corruption prove that the IMF is not able to do it. They don't give you a reason why the IMF is specifically good at this, especially when there is no on-the-ground electoral pressure to stop them. But secondly, they're removed from on-the-ground realities, as they tell you. They're negotiating primarily from with other economic exports. They're physically located further away in like fucking New York. But thirdly, the corruption is symmetric. It's often covered up by corrupt officials who try to cover up the fact that corruption is even happening in the first place. Another example of this is like raising tax revenue, which means that taking it from workers, building up more coercive tax structures from the places which you can access, disincentivizing people from moving to areas like Mombasa where you can get tax revenue. But thirdly, things like controlling spending has historically always been cuts to, public housing, healthcare, education. That's bad for short-term standards of living and bad for long-term economic growth because it caps the skill level of the labor pool and leads to a lower life expectancy. Secondly, austerity is bad for the civilian populace. Remember, the round is a question of whether or not we do austerity or we don't do austerity, because by extending the payment terms, you are controlling the same austerity systems which are already existing. Three reasons why austerity is bad. First, it inspires backlash. Citizens always tend to want to be wanting more resources than they are actually able to have, which means it's never a long-term strategic policy option, especially true when there are armed uprisings that can cause debt to be voided as odious. There's always an intense incentive for short-term political violence and upheaval, which notably solves the only concern about debt happening, because that debt is just eventually going to be voided as odious. But on our side of the house. But secondly, austerity always influences poor people because of corruption in Kenya. The political system is unstable enough to the point where government benefits for rich people will always be prioritized compared to the ones in power. And thirdly, it turns out that any argument they might go for about lower monthly payments, because the IMF is physically structuring the money that the Kenyan government can use, it turns all their arguments about short-term funding. But I also think that there's an autonomy principle to go for here. Specifically, I think that foreign agents ought not be able to interfere in the proceedings of countries themselves. It's by definition consent violative because of all of the arguments they're going for about the Kenyan government having an incentive to backstop these citizens. This is why, for example, IMF policies always have a low approval rating despite whoever is in power having a higher one. This tells you that regardless of who is elected in power, it beats all of their arguments about like whoever's elected in power being able to do these because they have the consent of the people, because they never have the consent of the people by definition to do these policies. They just do it anyway to get corruption. Then again, they do it without the populace knowing, so they have no ability to react. The implication here is that I think that just generally the Kenyan people are not able to consent to higher taxes, to consent to more problems coming upon them in the future when they don't know the trade-off that is occurring, because they don't know the debt that is being taken on. Therefore, I think that our side of the house, if you buy all of their credit rating arguments, where we just never borrow again, is a much more preferable scenario, even its worst case, because we tell you that the Kenyan people are actually making decisions and are in control of their own governance system. Second argument, debt restructuring leads to better fiscal stability. First, economic sovereignty is important. The Kenyan government needs to make long-term investments in infrastructure, which is strictly unachievable under IMF imposed directives, which ban them from doing so. Comparatively, debt restructuring buys time and room for the Kenyan government to make such decisions. So even if they're right, then in the long term, you can't do economic investment. In the short term, you can start those projects now. Only our side of the house has a risk of doing that, especially given the debt, that the collapse of the Kenyan default is inevitable. But secondly, debt restructuring is just more effective in solving corruption. Debt restructuring means creditors have personal stake and have a greater scrutiny from all angles. Their arguments about, creditors being really aggressive are wrong to the level where creditors have an incentive to keep the government up and running so that it can continue. This, whereas the IMF has much less of an incentive because their incentive is also ideological. A lot of the IMF is based on the Chicago Boys School of Thinking trained at our university, whereby their incentives are ideological. They want to create free market systems. Which means they're not even concerned with getting their money back necessarily, although that's a secondary factor. This argument tells you that no matter how good the repayment terms could potentially be because of the interests of creditors, the IMF itself is always going to be worse because they have an ideological incentive to do so, and they're backed by U.S. money, especially given that the United States is having to consider wars with quote unquote communism in countries like China, etc. They're incentivized to push the IMF to do that, given that the most of the funding is coming from the United States for organizations like the IMF. And the IMF has imperfect info. They're removed from the on-the-ground situation. They don't have dispatch an envoy into Kenya. Again, they just look at numbers on a spreadsheet, which means they don't have the ability to make the right decision in a lot of these instances. By a comparison, creditors are incentivized to do much more due diligence on this type of work. They're much more likely to be putting money into specific projects in Kenya, which means they're incentivized to actually get those projects to come out and actually get returns from those projects, as opposed to just bankrupting the country and getting vulture fund cash. On their arguments, I'll turn all their arguments on inflation. Their system likely has a variable interest rate. Countries are likely to have a much more unstable currencies due to high speculation. The impact is that in the long term, IMF funds are much more likely to be worse than in the short term, them paying it back faster. So even if they're right that the IMF is good, doing it short term is better. This is true for two reasons. First, the government always likely has an incentive to pay back, or is always going to likely pay back the same amount of loan later back in terms of real terms anyway because of inflation. But secondly, it's actually more because the government has net less money when inflation occurs. They're heavily reliant on things like tariffs, which means that if they are right and we are having a much more long-term view of the IMF paying back their money, Kenya paying back their money to the IMF, they have to pay back net more money in the long term than on our side of the house if they're still engaging with the IMF, but they're doing it on a much shorter time frame. Notably, this doesn't knife all the arguments about the principle because at least on our side of the house, there's a longer period of time where the Kenyan people have control over their government systems. But also, I think all their arguments about good incentives are extremely honest, just like neoliberal dog shit. I think historically, born from the pro-free market Bretton Woods conference, institutional memories like around Latin American structuralism being bad, Soviet-style command economies, etc., being bad. The IMF's biggest source of funding is the United States, which has veto power. There's severe power imbalances that can easily be abused, as it has by the United States during the Cold War. All of their arguments are notably coercive, and they also encourage the United States companies to get access to concessions from the government. Right? These companies don't just want their money back; they want control over entire economies to generate income in the long term. If you are encouraging the IMF to use that, the IMF is a proxy for those companies to have much more control, which means they're able to institute policies which make the actual hole that the Kenyan government is in deeper. On their arguments about them fearing IMF sanctions, this proves our coercion arguments. It proves that there's no buy-in from the IMF. The IMF doesn't care about what these small countries think. They can threaten sanctions and get them to do whatever they want. But also the Kenyan people being seen as severe, the Kenyan people probably see issues with the government as severe, which means that they are likely to encourage the government to do specific strategies to have a more long-term view, so their incentives arguments don't work. And the off case proves that their incentives for people to hide debt, so there's no ability for the Kenyan government to be held accountable by either party because they're taking on debt from new sources without even anyone knowing. On their restructuring as bad arguments, first, note that all the creditors are represented by the IMF. So if they are right, the IMF will institute checkbacks on this restructuring if they're also right that the IMF is good. And secondly, the IMF is always worse on the corruption stuff. The IMF is always non-democratic. They're imposing the economy regardless of who's being elected in power. And finally, we would say that corruption knifes everything here because if their money is right, money isn't being utilized right. It's preferable to not do any growth if all of this money is just being used for things like corruption. Vote on.
Thank the yellow for the great speech. I'll stop recording now for the MG. Oh, pause.
Okay. This will be off though. The first and most important thing is that debt collapse happens. Okay, fine. We can see that maybe it's unlikely that the Kenyan government is going to be able to hide its debt. But I think it's so true that when they say, oh, that you need massive investment on infrastructure projects, this is precisely the kind of investment that is impossible under the IMF. The info site literally says that they're trying to control spending. What does this controlling spending looks like? What does this controlling spending look like? In every other instance where the IMF has interfered to get countries to control their spending, they've made them cut down on public infrastructure projects. They've made them cut down on short-term public welfare spending under the idea that this is for budget. This is so that your budget balance sheets can look better. This is just empirically true. This is what they've always done. And I don't think they propose a convincing model as to why the IMF has suddenly found an innovative way to control spending while also putting in money for infrastructural growth so that countries can get out of bust cycles. And if anything, the limitation on the kind of public infrastructure investment that the IMF allows for means that countries like Kenya are far more likely to undergo sustained periods of minimal or negative economic growth, and consequently debt collapse just eventually becomes inevitable. When you're not making money, you have no money to pay back. This is regardless of what kind of austerity programs this is regardless of what specific anti-corruption measures IMF is able to put into use. They say that anti-corruption frees up funds to do long-term things. No, the way that the IMF is going to go about executing this anti-corruption regime, because they can't just put people into the Kenyan government to monitor people and to make sure that no one's ever indulging in any form of corruption, right? What they're going to do is they're going to do it hard and fast, and they're going to cut out whole swaths of the public service that they deem are inefficient, or maybe replace a couple key leaders. But the point about corruption is that it's endemic. It's likely that all these corrupt officials are protecting each other, and if you don't have enough scrutiny, as is the case in our world where you get these or you get like the creditors who have a personal stake in this, that they are able to like spend more money on scrutinizing this because they aren't like the IMF, they aren't like stretched thin all across the world. It's far more likely that we're able to stamp out corruption better, and therefore on their side of the house, you just end up with like a shrunken public service. You end up with like less public services provided, and it's unlikely that you're going to have any kind of like freed up funds to do long-term things, because these things are just going to go into like subsidizing like multinational corporations from coming in, because that's the kind of economic growth that the IMF believes is essential. Okay, and then they say that the IMF is more like that this debt default is not inevitable, that debt default is not inevitable because the IMF is stable. No, the IMF has a long track record of pushing countries into social political chaos. Think like, I guess, like Jordan, Ecuador, or like Ireland, right? Like all these countries have had their citizens protest against the kind of austerity measures that the IMF puts into place. And I think that with this kind of like general fabric of instability within your country, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to actually attract any form of like foreign direct investment. They're unable to have people like working if they're all on strikes and protesting in the streets, and therefore debt collapse just inevitably happens. And when this happens, this knocks out like most of their offense. Okay, next. We believe that the IMF is ill intentioned. Like they try to frame this IMF as like some like virtuous actors simply because they think we've done wrong things in the past, we want to correct for them now. No, that's not the priority of the IMF. So long as its main source of funding is still the US, so long as the US wishes to exercise any form of economic control over the global economy, either to firstly strengthen its own economic hegemony, and secondly to like fight back against like China's challenges against like its economic dominance. The IMF is just not motivated to like make itself look good because it has bigger priorities like satisfying its biggest funder, and it's just so influenced by the US's decisions that it can do like anything and just try to like optically cover up anyway. Like this whole like they're on their redemption arc just isn't true of the IMF, that even as early as like 2020 they were still pursuing the same kind of policies that they've always been pursuing, just because the ideological dogma runs so deep. And also the kind of programs that they're proposing that we're given in the info slide is are literally like classic neoliberal market fundamentalism measures, right? Like tax hikes and cutting welfare spending. And also like the IMF has like a second carrot system. They can just like keep utilizing the stake. They're problematic contracts which are able to renew, because once you sign on to an IMF program, the country can't just like withdraw itself out of it, and then this enables the IMF to exercise long-term control over it. And I think the key thing is just that the IMF is funded mainly by the US, which has huge incentives to maintain its economic hegemony. In comparison, when you have a diversified pool of creditors that have competing interests, that is, if you have say like both the China and the US as creditors, they're not simply at the mercy of like one specific country that has a say over like everything that goes on within your domestic economic policies, that's able to manipulate the way that you open up to certain industries if they deem it advantage to themselves, which is what the US has done in the past. It's what it has done in Latin America. It's what it has done in Southeast Asia. Okay, even if we give them their best case, that is that the IMF is well-intentioned, we still think that it's unable to be smart enough to actually solve the problems in Kenya that the Kenyan people care about. The first reason for this is imperfect information, that the IMF notably primarily engages technocrats, and they never engage with this. They're the people who actually understand what's on the ground for the Kenyan people. The people who represent the interests of the Kenyan people, like union leaders, are never the people who get an audience with the IMF. That the IMF only chooses to speak to economists, they choose to speak to central bankers, because this is historically how they've operated. They also don't offer us any like justifications or any burdens of proof as to why suddenly they're going to be able to they're suddenly going to be willing and able to talk to all these people on the ground. And as a result, the IMF is likely going to end up prescribing a kind of like one-size-fits-all model, which is what we see in the info slide, where it literally proposes all these like classic methods that have been proven to be ineffective, and yet it's still working on these. It's clear the IMF has never shown any form of like, oh, we're going to like improve our methods, even if it has like the best intentions. The best intentions is simply that it thinks that these methods are perfect and that these methods are going to work. Secondly, the IMF has different priorities from the people. That is, the Kenyan people on the ground likely want like alleviation to their short-term like cost of living crunches. They want better material standards of living. That they want to have better healthcare systems. They want to be able to send their kids to school. But these are the things that precisely the IMF does not prioritize. That because they're willing to sacrifice short-term proximate economic outcomes, for the sake of long-term economic growth, in the name of like, oh, if we do austerity now, you'll be able to like solve your problems later on. And this is because they're insulated from suffering, because they're so like far away, and also because like the numbers on spreadsheets are just dehumanizing. They don't see the extent of actual suffering on the ground. So this means that even if they think that what they're doing is helping the people, they don't understand what the people actually need, and they think that the people are mistaken in terms of what their priorities are, that they have like too short term of a focus, and that what they're actually doing is better. But that's just not the case. That when because if anything, the IMF, the type of prescribed forced opening up that the IMF gives, is just like absolutely terrible. IMF directives that increase inequality because tax hikes and subsidy cuts disproportionately affect lower and middle income families within Kenya, for whom like these taxes and subsidies take up like a far bigger proportion of their household budgets. So this just means is that inequality leads to more instability, and this is just unlikely to, and this just like inhibits and cripples them from accessing any form of future economic growth. And secondly, the IMF is not held accountable for their decisions because all these policies are written behind closed doors. They're not written in consultation with the public. They don't have to go through like democratic processes of voting. That is, even with the best intentions, right? They're still not going to be able to actually get like a public consensus as to whether or not this is something that they want, this is something that they think is helpful. And finally, IMF structural adjustment programs have just historically trapped developing countries in poverty traps. Because when you open up to like low-level manufacturing, when you open up to natural resource extraction, these countries suffer from the resource curse, that they're never able to upgrade and to move up the value chain. And the consequence of this is just that you're trapping these countries within a kind of like economic subjugation to more industrially advanced countries, such as the US, which is the main IMF funder, that has a direct incentive in prescribing this kind of economic imperialism onto countries like Kenya. And as a result, these countries are never going to be able to access any kind of long-term economic growth. So what does this look like for the Kenyan people? What does this look like for the Kenyan people? This just means that in the short term, they're going to be suffering from way less welfare, and in the long term, they're never going to have any kind of real improvements in their material standards of living. Comparatively, debt restructuring is free of these problems because it's not controlled by this one central organization, by the IMF, which is dominated by the US. So when you have a diverse pool of creditors, you spread the risk, and consequently, you get better like solvency for corruption and for long-term economic growth. How to oppose?
Thank the MO for the great speech. LOR whenever you're ready.
Faith, if you want to fill in some second ballot stuff, that'd be great. Okay. It'll be an LOR. The recordings, we turn the recording back on, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Cool. It'll just be framing and then a couple ballots. The framing that Gabe mishandles is all of the arguments about debt restructuring being inevitable. Notably, if I can win these arguments, the round changes. It's no longer a question of debt restructuring versus IMF questions. It is the question, do we do restructuring now, or does the IMF influence us a bunch just to do restructuring in the future? The only offense that matters coming out of the Gov, therefore, is that if I can prove this claim, is all of the analysis about the IMF being good and them making these economies better in the short term. If I can prove that the IMF influence is bad and in fairness worse than these creditors, we're winning the round on this question. The arguments I'll collapse are to prove this claim are A, the Kenyan ports argument. Notably, MG says this is an assertion. It's not. It's true. Kenya is in Eastern Africa. It controls a bunch of trade coming from the Suez Canal, etc., etc. And notably, they don't list a single other point where the output is likely going to be coming from. So even if you don't buy that, they don't fulfill their burden of proving where other forms of output are going to come. And secondly, even if you don't buy that argument that ports and economic trade is inherently volatile, you also buy that just the boom bust cycle is low-key kind of inevitable. Like their argument is, investment will be able to solve for this. Note A, this is a derivative of them proving that the IMF is good, which we'll get to later. But B, even if it is true, even in richer countries, we still see massive economic meltdowns that prompt borrowing. So there will be debt restructuring in either world. All of their offense, except for the IMF arguments, are symmetric completely. And it will involve creditors as well, by the way. So then, Feifei puts offense and defense on the entirety of MO, which I want you to look to as independent ballots. But I want you to look to a couple of arguments that we're going for here. First is the IMF backlash argument. Gabe found the odious debt spike, but he didn't beat all the analysis about backlash. Even if you don't presume all of their arguments are right about the IMF being good, people don't see them as good because of the LOC argument that people lose their healthcare benefits, and the MO arguments about their reputation in places like in events like the Cold War. And the MG so much as concedes this when they tell us that the IMF wants to quote unquote repair their reputation. Repair it from what? Probably because it's dog shit from the Cold War. Then backlash controls all of their arguments. Why? First, it leads to a transition and upheaval in governments as per the conceded LOC argument. Then they win that debt won't be odiously voided, but they don't win that the transitions from governments won't happen. So yeah, maybe governments are forced to reckon with the debt which they would of previous regimes, but they don't win that those transitions won't occur, and those transitions outweigh as a magnitude question. discussion, because notably, wars and conflicts, etc., destroy all of the infrastructure arguments that they're potentially going for. It also just leads to a loss of life, which is comparatively much larger than any arguments which they're able to go for. War leads to the involvement of other proxy actors. It leads to it expands the scope of the war, which leads to other countries getting involved. It leads to just generally more people. Leads to cyclic and social divisions, which just generally means that more people are upset at each other for a much longer term basis. So it impacts people on a longer term series of events as well. So ballot 2. Even if you don't buy the backlash argument, which I think is a priori because governments have to exist in order to concern questions about the creditors and the quality of life under those governments, why are creditors less extractive than the IMF? Because notably, on both sides of the house, there is some level of creditors existing. It's a time frame question. There are both creditor incentives for both the IMF and creditors in the short term and long term. I don't think they've sufficiently proven why the IMF other creditors are worse, given all of the arguments that we go for given the IMF is like representing these creditors, and also all the other arguments we go for about ideology. Both organizations have economic incentives. The only delta on this question is ideological incentives, because the IMF has a bunch of interest from these creditors, but notably, they also have the United States government pouring in fucking money so that they can create, coups in Africa or implement social policy to benefit their interests. Also, there's a bigger pool of creditors outside of the IMF. They're less dominated by one particular actor, i.e. the United States, and they have longer timelines because they're investors who acknowledge the risk exists and long-term payouts are a thing. So whereas the IMF is investing to try and, implement specific policies in these countries to get their short-term return back, creditors have built-in schemes so that they're able to get money from, say, the bridge that they build or the roads that they build. So they have longer-term incentives to actually make the system better. And the IMF reputation is worse for a reason. The burden on the gov is to prove that IMF experiences fundamental structural reform, which I don't think they do. The bottom line is that creditors are probably bad. The IMF is probably bad. We're winning on a time frame question because at least on our side of the house, there is a short period of time where the Kenyan government has some level of control over itself, such that it is able to invest and improve these infrastructure projects and to create areas, which means our side of the house only has a risk of escaping the boom bust cycle, number one. But number two, our side of the house is the only team which actually creates good economic benefits.
Thank the LOR for the great speech. I now invite the PMR to close out the debate as a whole. Here. And I assume this will still be recorded.
Cool. Is anyone not ready? Sorry about the lack of light. I don't have an overhead. The order of the speech should be intuitive as the speech happens. Cool. Obviously, debt restructuring is not 100% inevitable in our world. The only world it's 100% inevitable in is theirs. They have an argument which is basically some chance of debt restructuring happening later is worse. However, the issue is that they concede the turn from the MG, which is uniquely if you take the IMF loan. Now, even if it does inevitably lead to debt restructuring, the IMF loan gives you unique credibility when you negotiate with investors, and it gives the IMF aligned incentives to do stuff like ensure that you are not fucked by austerity measures because this looks really bad for their political incentives. The implication of this argument is that they have a 100% chance of triggering their own fucking impacts per the conceded PMC analysis, which is that the moment that you come to the creditors and say, hey, we really want a debt restructure, this is taken as a sign that you are literally on the verge of bankruptcy. And they've conceded the analysis from the PMC, which is bankruptcy is a question of margins, which means even if only 5 or 10% of creditors pull out as a result on their side of the house, they have just triggered a 100% inevitable impact that definitely leads to default. So if you're just a technical judge, you vote there. Why is default the worst impact in the round, more so than their bullshit analysis about political backlash? One, because it is the strongest controlling link into political backlash. This is articulated by MG and LOR, insofar as the LOR literally tells you that the reason people backlash against their government is because they cannot afford to fucking feed themselves. So we are winning, they're less able to fucking feed themselves. Two, because I think questions of nebulous colonialism are less visceral to the average Kenyan individual than questions of whether or not their government is actively foregoing what they perceive to be large economic development. And three, because we actually have the best link into well-being, because they have a tenuous link into political revolt, but we are just winning that structurally the economy is less likely to do stuff like welfare cuts, which does lead to death on a far wider and more structural scale insofar as it creates cycles of poverty than their arguments about flashpoint violence in specific instances of the political system. Let's go on clash. Who is more likely to cause default? Do you get better loan terms from the IMF or from creditors during the debt restructuring process? That's the central question of the round. Why are the IMF terms good? One, because they want buy-in from developing African economies, that is the so-called third world, who is literally called the third world because they did not side with capitalists or communists in the 20th century. Note the really good conceded MG analysis, which is that the IMF has already effectively captured the capitalist world. It is already the leading institution over the capitalist West.
There's a point, I think. There's a point.
Andrew. Sorry, Andrew. I think the argument that third world countries didn't take a side in the Civil War is new. It's sorry, the Cold War is new. It's kind of
wait, sorry, just to be clear, the MG says the whole point is that there are countries that didn't take a side in the war, and the IMF has already used up all the other countries. Andrew correctly pointed out that factually the word third refers to the first world being capitalist, the second world. You can strike it if you, it doesn't matter. The argument
it doesn't matter. Yeah, I'm extending something that's conceded from MG.
Does Op have anything to say?
If it's there, I missed it. Just if you find it, that's fine. Otherwise, whatever.
Okay, cool. I'll take it into consideration. I don't give leans. Okay, I have you 211.
Right. Like maybe the empirics flux of third world linguistically comes from this new, the actual warrant not. Great. Let's see. What was the last thing you have on your flow?
Yeah, I have like did not side with either of them. That's when the point of order was called and I stopped. Okay.
So TLDR, the IMF cares most about countries that have the potential to turn into competitors like BRICS and China, which means that these countries are the ones who are ideologically incentive. That is, ones that have not already been captured by one ideological camp. This is also in PMC. This means the IMF always has an incentive to offer good terms on an individual level because you have an active incentive to avoid your particular loan being the reason the entire Kenyan economy collapses, because that is how you get buy-in from other developing countries. Their only argument on this level is that the US controls IMF incentives, but they don't prove why the US has an incentive to cause the IMF economy to collapse. And our argument actually proves why the US benefits more in terms of soft power and dollarization extension from the IMF, from the economies like Kenya joining the IMF sphere, which means they are actually willing to do things like lose money on the investment, because the op literally concedes that the nature of the investment is political rather than financial. The implication of this is very simple. There are literal capacity constraints on the ability of investors to offer favorable terms to Kenya. Comparatively, the IMF is very comfortable with potentially losing money on the loan because they know that the political upside of getting buy-in from this group of actors outweighs that. Cool. This means the IMF offers sustainable loans. It means that they're unlikely to do stuff like cut welfare and infrastructure. Note that even if they are winning, that there are some welfare and some infrastructure cuts on our side of the house, they're not doing the comparative work. I.e., even if the IMF has some incentive to demand that Kenya cuts welfare, for example, they have less incentive than creditors because the IMF's incentive is to reduce corruption and enable long-term stability, which means they do, to an extent, value stuff like welfare apparatus insofar as they are an important part of Kenya's developing economy. Comparatively, creditors only have the incentive to be paid back right now before the Kenya runs out of money, which means they have a 100% structural incentive to do stuff like advocate for welfare cuts. The MO makes the argument that the US has incentives to open up markets to them only. One, the IMF also represents the incentives of other countries, so the US cannot just exclusively benefit themselves. The fact that there's competition among who gets the loan into the newly open Kenyan economy beats their argument, which is just an intuition pump that global markets are bad, but we are winning a structural reason why competition causes there to be better terms given, i.e. also, Cool. Comparatively, why do creditors get bad deals in restructuring? I already did the capacity constraint argument, but they're also just flat losing on the incentives claim. Some creditors want negotiations to fail. These are creditors with CDSs who have sold debt on the secondary market to vulture funds. This means they always hold out, and they concede the particular weighing argument from PMC, which is that the only thing necessary to trigger a country being considered bankrupt is it failing to pay back one specific creditor, because that is the nature of how bankruptcy works, which means bankruptcy is literally inevitable on their side of the house. And this triggers the PMC analysis, which this destroys the overall lending climate of Kenya as an economy, because it ensures the only creditors willing to lend to them are credibly predatory creditors, which is the actual controlling link into the long-term probability of austerity, which means that even if they're winning, there's more short-term austerity as a result of IMF loans. We are winning, there's structurally more instability and austerity in the long run. On the MO argument that the people like the IMF, I already beat this above. On the MO argument, the IMF only meets with bankers. This is obviously more true on their side of the house, insofar as the IMF has an incentive to meet with political leaders, whereas on their side of the house, you literally only meet with bankers. So for these reasons, very, very proud to propose.
I thank the PMR for the great speech and everyone for a great round. I invite speakers to cross floor, shake hands, make friends. I'll just remove my audio and yeah, you guys can chat and have fun. I'll be back soon.
Yeah, good round, y'all.
Good round, guys.
Okay, I'm back. So it took a bit. I had to also do some tab stuff. Um, cool. Uh, I'll probably. Oh wait, it's still recording. Fuck. I guess I can also record my OA. It's probably good for
We're
instructional.
fine with it.
Yeah, it's probably good for instructional value too, and you guys can shit on it if it's bad. Cool. 1 second. Also, is Gov here? Just confirming.
I'm here. PM is here.
Okay,
So is
perfect.
Gabe.
Cool. Let me just start my timer. Okay, I won't keep you guys in suspense. I picked over Gov, and while it was relatively close, I think there was some margin in terms of how I ended up picking Gov. Let's go through the way I'll structure it is I'll first go through like the ballots that OP decided to put through, then I'll go through Gov ballots and then I'll compare them. So let's first start with like OP ballots and why they don't necessarily work. I first want to make the observation that all of the stuff on like Kenya's tariff, boom bust cycles, and volatility actually hurts OP too because it also leads to more degree of op capacity to default. So just because your debt restructured doesn't mean that volatility goes away and doesn't hurt you coming into the future. So it's not helping the solvency path that op is trying to achieve. And without like the same set of mechanisms as Gov points out that I'll point out when I go through Gov ballots, it's quite harder because I'm not sure what the long-term end goal is because op is trying to watch the long-term end goal, but I can see a drastic difference on the harms that happen because they run away from this battle. The second thing that sort of like op tries to go for is the transition and upheaval that happens, which leads to war, which leads to conflicts, which leads to proxy actors and social divisions. I think I buy that there's at least some degree of upheaval and transition that happens during this period. I just don't think the warrants given are sufficient to cause like conflict leading to loss of lives to larger degrees of etc. proxy actor social division. It's possible, but it's a probabilistic argument. And without necessary weighing on the probabilities of how likely this is, I don't think I'm able to at least like use this to weigh out a lot of op argumentation. The other stuff that I don't think was brought out in the LOR that I do buy from up that I wish they did was the terms about like why austerity is the more central measure to be able to do corruption control. Because I think that's some really good material in MO that I do end up crediting. That is, there's at least some likelihood of some austerity measures because that's the most likely scenario to be able to get some degree of corruption control that the IMF wants, etc. Right? Uh, I'll get to this, but before that, on the ideological incentive. I think Op tries to say, oh, economic incentives are similar, but we have ideological incentives. I just think there's mitigation from Gov that the ideological incentive towards the US can still be satisfied. So you can still do things like dollarization. You can still do other things to stabilize the currency that also help the US, for example, but also keep you stronger, longer term power because you want to also get other countries. So at least there's degrees of mitigation for why you don't want to do it in the worst form that you can who choose policies that are helping both the US and also these countries in terms of their longer term goal for these countries. Then on the idea of just like I buy from op that there's at least some capacity for austerity to happen. Maybe there's some degree of harms that happen in terms of like shorter time periods. Um, okay. What do I then buy from Gov? I think I buy from Gov is just like large swathe of economic analysis on signaling and on, for example, a lot of like credibility. So a lot of like if both sides are agreeing that debt restructuring happens forward and both sides agree that there's possibility for defaults later, I think Gov is able to show to me that even if you do debt restructuring later, you get credibility by working with IMF on a signaling level, generally in terms of how other creditors see you. So if other creditors in the moment of current crisis see you debt restructuring, it has quite a drastically different perspective on other creditors than if this you working with IMF, which guarantees a given set of flexibility programs. And because creditors don't know the mechanisms of how other creditors will operate, and there's also like a lot of PMC analysis on this in terms of like how creditors are likely going to do more and more threat in these situations because they have incentive to, means that on a signaling level, there's more incentive to pull money out on their side of the house. So it's not just investment, as Op says, that's trying to solve everything. It's also preventing and keeping the investments reeled in and preventing them from moving out, as Gov is trying to claim, which likely happens on ops side depending on how these happens. Ops says, oh, there's at least some degree of competition that happens when you're competing between the RMB and the USD and different sets of resources. But I think Gov preempts this in PMC when they talk about like why there are mechanisms, things like BRICs, things like other organizations that you can also go to other than IMF in the future. So maybe IMF could do bad things before, but now structurally, because other organizations are on the rise, you're able to at least work with them. I don't think this argument is super true in real life. I don't think like BRICS is that big of a thing. But in the round, in the context of that, given that it was bought in the PMC and never really responded to, I think that preemption works when like Gov is bringing it back again, at least to wash out all of the competition stuff for the incentive analysis on economic stuff. So if OP is trying to say that the economics incentives are similar and then trying to win on ideological incentive, this mechanism at least washes that out and proves to you that economic incentives are not uh, symmetric, but rather fall more because creditors have far worse incentives than IMF, at least who in terms have incentives to start with better policy, do some crediting, but they also improve the economic efficiency. So improving your capacity to be able to go into the future and like do debt restructuring. If it happens in the future at some point of time, that's likely going to happen in better ways because they cannot just like do it in the most predatory way. I also buy a lot of analysis on secondary markets. So like if you don't pay back IMF will try to work through you. While if you don't pay back, for example, a creditor, they'll sell that debt. Like they're allowed to sell that debt on secondary market. They're allowed to sell it to venture funds, etc. I think there's some response that comes from the LOC, but I think this claim just stands and is pulled through like quite directly that IMF is unable to do so. IMF cannot now just go and sell your debt to vulture funds the same way other creditors can do. So even if there are some cases where this happens, I think IMF is able to get away from that because they like literally have the capacity not to. In which situation they at least are able to like ensure at least on your currency, at least on your level, that you're able to like pay it back, etc. So I think on general, I buy then in terms of the debt and how debt continues, that you just get better degrees of capacity into recovery, which I from op don't buy how the recovery is happening. So I think ops case is relatively focused on negative. I think gov's case is more focused in terms of how the recovery process happens. But in the process of harm, that is the default, I buy from gov that there's lesser probability of default and there's more stabilization of currency, etc., which also acts towards the recovery like impact that gov is going for. So I think those were my rationale in terms of why I ended up giving this to gov. But I think like this is relatively close. I think at least like on a larger scale, uh, weighing question of like how it got ended up decided in terms of like austerity happens on both sides. I think at the end of the debate, I didn't believe like austerity was won by the other team other. I believe like austerity is likely to be done by both set of creditors and IMF. So I don't think it ends up making such a case because the incentive analysis is stronger from Gov. But I think like op can definitely win that and could have won this in even in this round with like a little bit more legwork, which could have like changed a lot of cases in terms of Gov, which is trying to win both no austerity and also recovery, which I think is harder to do from Gov because like you cannot win both in an ideal world. Yeah, that's my way. Any questions, I can answer them. Otherwise, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think PMR would have been more effective if I just focused on the weighing line, which just concedes there's some austerity in both worlds, and just as the comparative incentive work on why the IMF has less of an incentive to do lots of austerity rather than going for the best case and that?
Yeah, that's fine. And I think you do some version of it. I also think like Gov can go and say like austerity is not like necessarily bad in terms of like evading the crisis. So you can talk about like currency stabilization is okay. Like if you want to stabilize currency, if you want to get through. So this is the round C capital controls debate, right? Which is like what do you do in this given situation? What will happen if you're going to get fucked in either word? It's not necessarily the same of how you get fucked in either word. So you can even concede, even if you get more austerity, that's still okay. Like austerity is like not a demon that's bad. And that's like sometimes some inefficient deficit spending is bad. I think MG also talks about inefficiencies and then MO also talks about they'll cut through. And then you can just go and say like, yeah, some inefficiencies are good to cut. Like not all infrastructure projects yield the same like degree of economic stimulus, for example.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, that makes sense. I had like part of that argument like drafted and just didn't go that direction. That makes sense.
Yeah, because like I agree that austerity is more easier to weigh on op. That is like it does cause short-term harm. But I think like in debates about economic crisis, I think solution paths are the most comparative things to do because I think everyone is just running to the bottom. Creditors have bad incentives, IMF has bad incentives, good incentives, and you have to engage in that battle anyway if you want to win. But I think like the more clearer path you have towards recovery is easier to weigh because like if shit is freely falling in both sides of the world, what is your part to like recovery? And I end up like deciding the deadlock on your recovery path, your currency stabilization stuff, your peg stuff, in terms of like your signaling effect and investor confidence stuff, because that's some way I see for Kenyan economy to succeed from the crisis it is in now. And I think focusing more on that could be a more effective PMR.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Thanks for a great RFD.
Thanks so much, y'all. Appreciate
Good
it.
luck.
If you guys have any questions, you can reach out to me in Discord, but I have to go do SAP stuff, so I'll
Yeah, I'll
hopefully.
message you. I'll message you later.
Okay,
All right.